The words hit me like a freight train on that quiet Tuesday afternoon in September. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the window, watching the golden leaves dance in the autumn breeze when my 7-year-old grandson Tommy came running into my living room with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Grandma Eleanor," he whispered, his small voice trembling with confusion and hurt. "I heard Mommy and Daddy talking last night. They said, when you go to heaven, they're going to sell your house and use all your money to buy a big boat and move far away without me." The innocence in his eyes as he spoke those devastating words made my heart shatter into a million pieces. Here was this precious child, my daughter Jessica's son, unknowingly revealing the cruel reality of what my own family had been planning behind my back for who knows how long. I'm Eleanor Patterson, 74 years old, and I've lived in this beautiful Victorian home in Charleston, South Carolina for nearly 50 years. My late husband Robert and I bought this house when Jessica was just a toddler, and we filled every room with love, laughter, and memories that I thought would be treasured by future generations. After Robert passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, this house became my sanctuary, my connection to all the beautiful years we shared together. The wraparound porch where we used to drink sweet tea and watch the sunset, the kitchen where I taught Jessica how to bake her grandmother's famous pecan pie, the garden where Robert grew the most magnificent roses in the entire neighborhood. Every corner of this place holds a piece of my soul. When Jessica married her husband Marcus 5 years ago, I was overjoyed. He seemed like a decent man, hard-working and ambitious, though I always sensed something calculating behind his charming smile. They moved into a modest apartment across town, and Marcus worked as a sales manager at a local car dealership, while Jessica taught 3rd grade at the elementary school just down the street from my house. When Tommy was born, I thought I'd never experienced such pure happiness. Being a grandmother felt like getting a second chance at motherhood, and I spoiled that little boy with all the love my heart could hold. Every weekend, he'd spend at least one night at my house, and we'd have the most wonderful adventures together, building blanket forts, making chocolate chip cookies from scratch, and reading bedtime stories until he fell asleep in my arms. But something changed about 2 years ago when Marcus started talking constantly about investment opportunities and get-rich-quick schemes. Suddenly, every conversation at family dinners revolved around money. How much this person made, how much that person spent, how unfair it was that some people had more than others. Jessica started chiming in too, making comments about how lucky some people were to inherit family wealth and how hard it was for young families to get ahead in today's economy. At first, I thought it was just normal financial stress that every young couple faces, especially with a growing child and all the expenses that come with raising a family in an increasingly expensive world. Then the hints started becoming more direct. Marcus would walk through my house during visits, commenting on the antique furniture, the original hardwood floors, the value of the neighborhood. "This place must be worth a fortune now, Eleanor," he'd say with that calculating gleam in his eyes. "You're sitting on a gold mine here." Jessica would quickly change the subject, but I could see her nodding in agreement, and I started noticing how she'd study my jewelry box when she thought I wasn't looking, or how she'd ask seemingly innocent questions about my financial advisor and my will. The turning point came 6 months ago when they started pressuring me to move into a retirement community. "Mom, you're getting older, and this house is so big for just one person," Jessica would say with fake concern. "What if something happens and no one's here to help you? Wouldn't you be happier around people your own age?" Marcus would jump in with statistics about home invasions and medical emergencies, painting terrifying pictures of all the dangers I faced living alone. They even went so far as to bring me brochures for various senior living facilities, all conveniently located hours away from Charleston, far from the life and community I'd built over decades. But I wasn't ready to give up my independence, and I certainly wasn't ready to abandon the home where I'd created a lifetime of precious memories. I'm in excellent health for my age, I have wonderful neighbors who look out for me, and I have a cleaning lady who comes twice a week to help with the heavier household tasks. Most importantly, I have Tommy, and the thought of living somewhere far away from my beloved grandson was absolutely heartbreaking. Every time I gently declined their suggestions about moving, I could see the frustration growing in both Jessica and Marcus's eyes. Though they tried to hide it behind concerned smiles and loving words. That's when the emotional manipulation began in earnest. They started limiting Tommy's visits to my house, claiming he had too much homework or too many playdates with children from school. When I'd call to invite him over for the weekend, there was always some excuse: a birthday party, a family obligation, a sudden illness that miraculously cleared up by Monday morning. The monthly family dinners that had been a cherished tradition for years suddenly became sporadic, and when they did visit, the conversations felt strained and artificial, as if they were going through the motions of maintaining a relationship while secretly resenting my continued existence in my own home. What I didn't realize until that devastating afternoon when Tommy came to me with tears in his eyes was that they weren't just hoping I'd eventually decide to move into a retirement home. They were actively planning for my death, discussing how they'd liquidate my assets, and apparently had already decided that Tommy was somehow expendable in their grand plans for my inheritance. The innocence of a 7-year-old child had inadvertently exposed the ugly truth about the people I loved most in the world, and I knew in that moment that everything was about to change forever. As I held Tommy in my arms that afternoon, trying to comfort him while my own world crumbled around me, I realized I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. "Sweetheart," I said gently, wiping away his tears, "can you tell Grandma exactly what Mommy and Daddy said? I know it's hard, but it's very important." Tommy sniffled and looked up at me with those big brown eyes that reminded me so much of Jessica when she was his age. They were in the kitchen after I went to bed, but I got thirsty and came downstairs. They didn't see me hiding behind the door. His voice was barely a whisper as he continued. "Daddy said something about how much money you have in the bank, and Mommy said when you die, everything will be theirs. Then Daddy said they could sell this house for lots and lots of money and buy a boat and sail around the world." My blood ran cold as Tommy continued recounting the conversation he'd overheard. "Mommy said they wouldn't need to worry about babysitting anymore because they'd be free to do whatever they wanted. Daddy laughed and said I'd probably be better off in boarding school anyway because I'd learned to be more independent. Then Mommy said maybe they should start looking at schools in other countries so they could travel and I could get an international education." The way Tommy pronounced international with such careful precision, obviously repeating a word he'd heard but didn't fully understand, broke my heart even more. This innocent child was describing his own parents planning to essentially abandon him once they got their hands on my money. But what Tommy told me next made my hands shake with rage. Then Daddy said something about maybe you might, go to heaven sooner if you lived in one of those old people places because they don't take as good care of people there. Mommy told him to stop talking like that. But then she said maybe if you had an accident or got really sick, it would be sad, but also kind of a blessing because you wouldn't have to suffer anymore. I tried to keep my expression calm for Tommy's sake, but inside I was reeling from the implication that they were actually hoping for my death, possibly even considering ways to accelerate it. That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep in the guest room, I couldn't bear to send him home after what he'd revealed. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. These weren't just greedy relatives hoping to inherit my wealth someday in the distant future. These were people actively planning their lives around my death, discussing my assets as if they already belonged to them, and callously dismissing the well-being of their own child in pursuit of financial gain. The daughter I'd raised with so much love and sacrifice had apparently inherited none of my values, and the man she'd married had revealed himself to be even worse than I'd initially suspected. I spent most of that night walking through my house, looking at everything with new eyes. The antique dining room set that had belonged to my grandmother, the collection of first-edition books that Robert had lovingly assembled over decades, the hand-painted china that had been a wedding gift from my own mother. Everything felt tainted now by the knowledge of how Jessica and Marcus viewed these treasures. They weren't family heirlooms to be cherished and passed down through generations. They were simply dollar signs, assets to be liquidated as quickly as possible to fund their selfish dreams of adventure and luxury. But it was thinking about Tommy that really crystallized my resolve to take action. This precious little boy, who had done nothing wrong except be born to parents who viewed him as an inconvenience, deserved so much better than what they were planning for him. The thought of him being shipped off to some boarding school in a foreign country while his parents sailed around the world on money they'd inherited from his beloved grandmother was absolutely unconscionable. I'd spent 7 years building a relationship with Tommy, teaching him about kindness and integrity and the importance of family, only to discover that his own parents were planning to throw all of those values away the moment I was no longer around to witness their betrayal. Over the next few days, I watched Jessica and Marcus more carefully than I ever had before, and the signs of their deception became glaringly obvious. During their next visit, Marcus spent most of his time walking around my house with his phone, and I realized he was probably taking pictures or videos to assess the value of my possessions. Jessica kept steering conversations toward my health, asking probing questions about my doctor visits and whether I'd been feeling more tired lately. They both seemed unusually interested in my daily routine, asking about my exercise habits, my diet, and whether I'd been taking my medications regularly. Most disturbing of all was how they interacted with Tommy during these visits. Instead of the loving parents I'd always believed them to be, I now saw how they mostly ignored him unless he was being particularly cute or entertaining for my benefit. They seemed to view his affection for me as a tool to manipulate my emotions, rather than as a genuine relationship that brought joy to both of us. When Tommy would ask to stay overnight at my house, they'd exchange these meaningful glances that I now understood were calculations about how much goodwill they needed to maintain with me to protect their future inheritance. The final straw came when I overheard Jessica on the phone in my garden while I was preparing lunch in the kitchen. She was talking to someone about the situation with Mom and how they needed to be patient for just a little while longer. She actually laughed as she said, "At her age, it shouldn't be too much longer anyway, and then we'll finally be able to start really living." The casual cruelty in her voice as she discussed my mortality, like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her life, plans made me realize that the daughter I thought I knew and loved had perhaps never really existed at all. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't continue living in denial about who Jessica and Marcus really were, and more importantly, I couldn't allow them to destroy Tommy's life with their selfish schemes. But I also knew I needed to be strategic about how I handled this situation. If I confronted them directly, they'd probably deny everything and cut off my access to Tommy completely. If I simply changed my will without explanation, they might challenge it legally or take their anger out on my grandson. I needed a plan that would protect Tommy while ensuring that justice was served to the people who had betrayed my trust so completely. The next morning, I called my attorney, David Richardson, who had been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years. David had helped Robert and me write our original wills, and he'd updated my estate planning after Robert's death. I'd always trusted him completely, and I knew he'd help me navigate this complicated situation with discretion and wisdom. "Eleanor," he said, when I explained why I needed to see him urgently, "I'm so sorry you're dealing with this. Unfortunately, family inheritance disputes are more common than you might think, but the level of callousness you're describing is particularly disturbing." During our meeting that afternoon, David explained my options in detail. "Your current will leaves everything to Jessica, with the understanding that she'll provide for Tommy's education and well-being. Given what you've discovered about their intentions, we need to restructure everything to protect your grandson's interests." We spent hours going through various scenarios and legal strategies. David suggested creating a trust that would provide for Tommy's needs throughout his childhood and education, while ensuring that Jessica and Marcus couldn't access the principal or misuse the funds for their own purposes. But I wanted to go further than just protecting Tommy financially. "David," I said, "I want to make sure they understand that their actions have consequences. I don't want them to be able to profit from their betrayal in any way." David nodded thoughtfully and suggested we explore some creative alternatives that would send a clear message about the importance of family loyalty and moral integrity. He mentioned several charitable organizations that I'd supported over the years, including the local children's hospital where Tommy had been born and the Literacy Foundation that provided books to underprivileged schools in our area. Over the following weeks, David and I crafted a comprehensive new estate plan that I was confident would serve justice while protecting the people and causes I truly cared about. The centerpiece was a trust for Tommy that would cover all his educational expenses, provide a comfortable living allowance throughout his childhood, and give him access to a substantial inheritance when he turned 25. But only if he demonstrated the values of kindness, integrity, and service to others that I'd tried to instill in him. If he chose to follow in his parents' footsteps and became someone who valued money over family, the trust would instead donate everything to charity. But I wasn't finished yet. I also decided to implement some immediate changes that would give me a clearer picture of Jessica and Marcus's true intentions while protecting myself from any potential harm they might be planning. I hired a private investigator named Sarah Chen, who specialized in family fraud cases, to look into their financial situation and see if there were any other schemes or debts I should know about. I also installed a sophisticated home security system with cameras and motion sensors, partly for my own protection, but also to document any suspicious behavior during their visits. What Sarah discovered over the next month was even worse than I'd imagined. Marcus wasn't just a car salesman with big dreams. He was actually deeply in debt from failed investment schemes and had been borrowing against credit cards to maintain their lifestyle. Jessica knew about the debt, but had been lying to me about their financial stability, and they'd apparently been counting on my inheritance to solve all their problems. Even more disturbing, Sarah found evidence that they'd been researching retirement homes with poor safety records and high mortality rates, presumably hoping to convince me to move somewhere that would increase the likelihood of my death. But the most shocking discovery came when Sarah followed them to a marina outside of town, where they'd apparently already put a down payment on an expensive yacht, using forged documents that listed my house as collateral. They'd been so confident of their eventual inheritance that they'd started spending money they didn't legally have, assuming I'd be dead soon enough that no one would ever discover their fraud. The yacht salesman confirmed that Jessica and Marcus had told him they were expecting a large family inheritance very soon, and had shown him pictures of my house and its contents as proof of their future wealth. Armed with this evidence, I realized that my situation was even more dangerous than I'd initially understood. These weren't just greedy relatives hoping to inherit my money someday. They were criminals who had already committed fraud and were potentially willing to accelerate my death to cover their tracks. The gentle, patient approach I'd been considering was no longer appropriate. I needed to take immediate action to protect both myself and Tommy from people who had proven themselves capable of anything in pursuit of financial gain. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching Tommy play with the neighborhood cat, I made the final decision about how to handle this betrayal. I would give Jessica and Marcus one last chance to reveal their true nature publicly, in a way that would leave no doubt about their character and intentions. I would host a family gathering under the pretense of discussing my future living arrangements, but instead, I would expose everything I'd learned about their plans and give them the justice they deserved. The time for subtlety and careful maneuvering was over. It was time for the truth to come to light and for the consequences of their actions to be laid bare for everyone to see. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully orchestrating what would become the most important family gathering of my life. I called Jessica and told her I'd been doing a lot of thinking about our previous conversations regarding retirement communities and that I was finally ready to have a serious discussion about my future. "I think you and Marcus were right," I said, injecting just the right amount of resignation into my voice. "This house is getting to be too much for me, and maybe it's time I started considering other options." I could practically hear the excitement in Jessica's voice as she eagerly agreed to come over the following Sunday for what she assumed would be my surrender to their manipulation. But I wasn't planning to face this alone. I invited my sister Margaret, who lived 2 hours away in Savannah, along with her husband James and their adult daughter Caroline. Margaret had always been the more practical and outspoken of the two of us, and I knew I'd need her support for what I was about to do. I also asked my longtime neighbors, the Hendersons, to join us. Bill and Martha Henderson had lived next door for 15 years, and they'd witnessed firsthand how devoted I was to Tommy, and how much effort I put into maintaining relationships with Jessica and Marcus, despite their increasingly demanding behavior. Most importantly, I arranged for David Richardson to be present, ostensibly to discuss the legal aspects of selling my house and transferring assets, but actually to serve as a witness to everything that was about to unfold. I also asked Sarah Chen to position herself nearby with recording equipment in case we needed documentation of Jessica and Marcus's reactions to what I was planning to reveal. Tommy would be staying with Margaret and James for the afternoon, safely away from the confrontation that was about to destroy his parents' carefully constructed facade. The morning of the gathering, I prepared my house like I was hosting the most important dinner party of my life. I made Jessica's favorite peach cobbler and Marcus's beloved fried chicken, and I set the dining room table with my finest china and crystal. I wanted everything to be perfect, because I knew this would likely be the last time my family would ever be together in this house under the pretense of love and unity. As I arranged fresh flowers from my garden in the crystal vase that had been my wedding gift from Robert's mother, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. After months of uncertainty and betrayal, I was finally taking control of my own story. Jessica and Marcus arrived exactly on time, both dressed more formally than usual and wearing expressions of barely contained anticipation. Marcus immediately began complimenting the house again, making comments about the beautiful woodwork and the stunning view from the front porch. Jessica was more subtle, but I caught her looking around with the same calculating expression I'd noticed before, probably mentally cataloging everything she expected to inherit. They both seemed unusually solicitous toward me, bringing flowers and expensive wine, clearly trying to stay in my good graces during what they thought would be their final push to convince me to sell everything and move away. When Margaret, James, and Caroline arrived, followed shortly by the Hendersons and David Richardson, Jessica and Marcus seemed slightly confused by the larger gathering, but they maintained their charming facades. "How wonderful that the whole family could be here for such an important discussion," Jessica said with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Marcus immediately began working the room, telling stories and making jokes, clearly trying to win over the additional witnesses to whatever decision I was supposedly about to make. As we sat down to dinner, I played the role of the elderly matriarch one last time, making sure everyone had enough food and facilitating pleasant conversation about family memories and neighborhood news. But underneath my calm exterior, my heart was pounding with anticipation for what was coming next. I watched Jessica and Marcus carefully throughout the meal, noting how they kept exchanging meaningful glances and how Marcus kept steering the conversation toward topics related to my health and the challenges of maintaining such a large house at my age. After we'd finished eating and I'd served coffee and dessert, I stood up and cleared my throat to get everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. "As Jessica and Marcus know, I've been thinking a lot lately about my future and what's best for everyone involved. I've come to some important decisions that I want to share with all of you, because family should always be honest with each other about the things that matter most." Jessica and Marcus both leaned forward expectantly, clearly anticipating that I was about to announce my plans to sell the house and move into a retirement community. The greedy anticipation in their eyes was so obvious that I wondered how I'd missed it for so long. Margaret caught my eye from across the table and gave me an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. She'd always been able to read me better than anyone else, and I knew she sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Before I tell you about my decisions regarding the house and my living arrangements," I continued, "I need to share something else with everyone here. Something that has caused me tremendous pain and has fundamentally changed how I view certain relationships in my life." The room fell completely silent, and I could see confusion starting to replace anticipation on Jessica and Marcus's faces. This wasn't going according to their script, and they were beginning to realize that perhaps they'd misunderstood the purpose of this gathering. I took a deep breath and looked directly at my daughter and son-in-law, knowing that the next words out of my mouth would change everything forever. "I know about your plans," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly tense room. "I know about the conversations you've been having about my death, about selling this house, about abandoning Tommy, and about all the other schemes you've been pursuing behind my back." The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Jessica's face went completely white, and Marcus looked like he'd been struck by lightning. I watched as panic flashed across both their faces, followed quickly by desperate attempts to maintain their composure in front of the other family members who were now staring at them with growing understanding and disgust. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about," Jessica stammered, but her voice lacked any conviction, and I could see her hands trembling as she reached for her water glass. Let me be more specific, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I know that you've been discussing how much money you'll inherit when I die, how you plan to sell this house and use the proceeds to buy a yacht and travel the world. I know that you've been hoping I'll move into a retirement home with poor safety records so that my death might come sooner rather than later. I know that you've already committed fraud by using my house as collateral for a down payment on that yacht you've been secretly purchasing. And most heartbreakingly, I know that you've been planning to send Tommy away to boarding school so that you can pursue your selfish dreams without the inconvenience of raising your own son. Marcus jumped to his feet, his face now flushed red with anger and embarrassment. This is ridiculous, Eleanor. I don't know who's been filling your head with these lies, but you're obviously being manipulated by someone who wants to turn you against your own family. His voice was loud and aggressive, but I could hear the desperation underneath his bluster. He was a man whose carefully constructed plans were crumbling before his eyes, and he was lashing out like a cornered animal. Sit down, Marcus, I said calmly, and the authority in my voice made him sink back into his chair despite himself. I haven't been manipulated by anyone. These aren't lies or rumors or misunderstandings. I have documentation of everything I've just described, including recordings of your conversations, photographs of your fraudulent documents, and detailed reports from the private investigator I hired to look into your activities. I gestured toward David Richardson, who opened his briefcase and began pulling out folders full of evidence that Sarah Chen had compiled over the past month. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. How could you spy on us like that? We're your family. Even if we said some things in private that might have sounded bad, you know we love you and would never actually hurt you. But even as she spoke, I could see her looking around the room at the faces of my sister, my neighbors, and my attorney, all of whom were staring at her with expressions of shock and disappointment. The most devastating part of all this, I continued relentlessly, is what you were planning to do to Tommy. Your own son, who loves you both unconditionally, was going to be discarded like an unwanted burden the moment you got your hands on my money. You were actually laughing about how much easier your lives would be without him, discussing boarding schools in foreign countries like you were shopping for a storage facility for furniture you didn't want anymore. Margaret finally spoke up, her voice shaking with rage. Jessica, how could you even think such things, let alone say them out loud? That little boy worships you both, and you were planning to abandon him for money that isn't even yours yet? Caroline nodded in agreement, adding, I can't believe you're the same person I grew up thinking of as my responsible, loving cousin. This is absolutely despicable. Bill Henderson, who had always been fond of Jessica and had watched her grow up, looked like he was struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with what he was hearing. Jessica, sweetheart, please tell me there's some explanation for this that makes sense. Please tell me you haven't really been planning to hurt your mother and abandon your son. But Jessica just sat there staring at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes, her silence serving as confirmation of everything I'd accused them of. Marcus, realizing that denial was no longer possible, switched tactics and tried to justify their actions. Look, everyone's acting like we committed some terrible crime, but all we did was have some private conversations about hypothetical situations. Yes, we've been frustrated about our financial situation. And yes, we've talked about what might happen someday when Eleanor passes away naturally. But we never actually did anything to hurt her. And we certainly never planned to abandon Tommy. Actually, you did do something, David Richardson interjected, his professional demeanor making his words carry even more weight. You committed fraud when you used Eleanor's property as collateral without her knowledge or consent. That's a felony that could result in serious prison time. You also filed false insurance claims and made misrepresentations to financial institutions. These aren't hypothetical conversations we're discussing. These are documented crimes that have already been committed. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the full extent of Jessica and Marcus's deception became clear to everyone present. But I wasn't finished yet. I still had the most important part of my revelation to share. The part that would ensure Tommy's future was protected and that justice was served. Which brings me to the decisions I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I said, standing up again to address the room with formal dignity. I've spent the past month completely restructuring my estate plans, and I want everyone here to witness the announcement of those changes." Jessica and Marcus both looked like they were about to be sick, finally understanding that their schemes hadn't just been discovered. They were about to face the consequences of their betrayal in the most definitive way possible. The reckoning they'd never imagined was about to begin, and there would be no going back from what I was about to reveal. I walked over to my antique writing desk and retrieved a leather portfolio that contained the new legal documents David and I had spent weeks preparing. As I returned to my place at the head of the dining room table, I could feel the tension in the room reaching a breaking point. Jessica was crying silently now, mascara running down her cheeks, while Marcus sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles in his face twitching with barely controlled fury. "These are the documents that will govern the distribution of my estate," I announced, placing the portfolio on the table where everyone could see it. "As of last Friday, my previous will has been completely revoked and replaced with new arrangements that reflect my true values and priorities." I opened the portfolio and began reading from the summary that David had prepared. "First, and most importantly, I have established a comprehensive trust for my grandson Tommy, which will provide for all his needs throughout his childhood and ensure he receives an excellent education and a substantial inheritance when he comes of age." Jessica looked up with a flicker of hope in her eyes, clearly thinking that Tommy's trust might still provide them with access to my money through their parental rights. But I quickly dispelled that notion. The trust will be administered by independent trustees who have been specifically instructed to ensure that Tommy's parents have no access to these funds and no influence over how they are used. Tommy will live with my sister Margaret and her family, who have agreed to provide him with the stable, loving home environment that he deserves. The shock on Jessica's face was almost comical as she realized that not only were they not getting my money, but they were also losing custody of their son. "You can't take Tommy away from us," she protested, her voice rising to a near shriek. "He's our child, and you have no legal right to interfere with our parental rights." But David immediately corrected her misunderstanding. "Actually, given the evidence of fraud, financial instability, and documented discussions about abandoning the child, a family court would almost certainly find that Tommy's best interests are served by alternative arrangements. Your mother isn't taking him away from you. You forfeited your right to raise him through your own actions." I continued reading from my new estate plan, detailing how the remainder of my assets would be distributed. 50% of my remaining estate will go to establish the Tommy Patterson Foundation, which will provide scholarships for children whose parents have abandoned them or who are being raised by grandparents and other relatives. 25% will go to the Charleston Children's Hospital, where Tommy was born and where I've volunteered for many years. The remaining 25% will be distributed among various other charities that focus on protecting children and supporting families in crisis. Marcus finally exploded, jumping to his feet and slamming his hand on the table so hard that the wine glasses rattled. "This is insane. You're giving millions of dollars to strangers while your own family gets nothing? We're drowning in debt, Eleanor, and you have more money than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. How can you be so cruel and selfish?" His outburst revealed the true nature of his character more clearly than any private conversation ever could. Even in this moment of being confronted with evidence of his own crimes and betrayals, he still felt entitled to my money and viewed my charitable giving as somehow stealing from him. "Cruel and selfish?" I repeated, my voice deadly calm. "You think it's cruel and selfish for me to protect my grandson from parents who were planning to abandon him? You think it's selfish for me to refuse to reward people who committed fraud using my property and who were hoping for my death so they could fund their luxury lifestyle?" I stood up and walked around the table to stand directly in front of Marcus, looking him straight in the eye. "What's cruel and selfish is betraying the trust of someone who has loved and supported you for years. What's cruel and selfish is viewing your own mother-in-law as nothing more than a bank account with an inconvenient pulse." Margaret had been quietly crying throughout this entire confrontation, but now she stood up and put her arms around me in support. "Eleanor, I'm so proud of you for having the courage to stand up to them. What they were planning was monstrous, and Tommy deserves so much better than parents who would treat him as disposable." James nodded in agreement, adding, We'll take wonderful care of Tommy, and we'll make sure he grows up knowing how much his grandmother loved him and why she made these difficult decisions. Caroline, who worked as a social worker and had experience with family dysfunction, looked at Jessica with professional disappointment. I've seen a lot of bad parenting in my career, but planning to abandon your child for money is something that will haunt me for a long time. Tommy is lucky to have a grandmother who was willing to protect him even when it meant breaking her own heart. Her words seemed to hit Jessica harder than anything else that had been said, perhaps because they came from someone close to her own age who might have understood the pressures of young parenthood. The Hendersons, who had remained silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. Martha wiped tears from her eyes as she said, "Eleanor, we've watched you pour your heart into that little boy for years, and we've also watched how Jessica and Marcus have taken your generosity for granted. You're doing the right thing, even though it must be breaking your heart." Bill added, "We'll be here to help however we can, and we'll make sure everyone in the neighborhood knows what kind of people they really are." But I wasn't finished with my announcements yet. There was one more consequence that Jessica and Marcus needed to understand. One final piece of justice that would ensure they could never again victimize anyone the way they had tried to victimize me. I returned to my portfolio and pulled out one final document that I had hoped I would never need to use. "There's one more matter we need to address," I said, my voice taking on the formal tone I had perfected during my years working as a legal secretary before I married Robert. "David, would you please explain to Jessica and Marcus the legal consequences of their actions that we discussed in your office?" David Richardson cleared his throat and opened his own briefcase, retrieving a folder marked with official court seals and law enforcement letterheads. "Eleanor came to me not just for estate planning advice, but also because she was concerned about potential criminal activity," David began, his professional demeanor making the gravity of the situation crystal clear. "After reviewing all the evidence that was gathered, I advised her that she had a legal obligation to report the fraud that had been committed using her property as collateral. As of this morning, formal charges have been filed with the Charleston Police Department and the District Attorney's Office." The color drained completely from Marcus's face as the full implications of what David was saying began to sink in. Jessica started hyperventilating, grabbing onto the edge of the table for support as she realized that their problems extended far beyond just losing an inheritance. They were facing actual criminal prosecution for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. "The documentation is extensive and undeniable," David continued relentlessly. "Bank records showing the fraudulent loan application, recorded conversations discussing the scheme, photographs of forged documents, and witness testimony from the yacht dealer who can confirm that you misrepresented your financial situation and used property that didn't belong to you as collateral. The prosecutor believes this is a slam-dunk case that will likely result in significant prison time for both of you." Marcus tried one last, desperate gambit, turning to me with tears in his eyes and dropping to his knees beside my chair. "Eleanor, please, I'm begging you. We made terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We'll pay back every penny. We'll move away and never bother you again. Just please don't send us to prison. Think about what this will do to Tommy. He'll have parents in jail on top of everything else." But his plea for mercy only strengthened my resolve, because it proved that even now, facing the consequences of his actions, he was still trying to manipulate my emotions and use Tommy as a shield for his own crimes. "You should have thought about Tommy before you decided to commit fraud and plan to abandon him," I replied firmly. "You should have thought about the consequences before you betrayed my trust and plotted to benefit from my death. Most importantly, you should have thought about being decent human beings before you chose greed over family loyalty and love." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Tommy and I had spent so many happy hours together, knowing that this would be one of the last times I'd see this view without heartbreak coloring the memory. Jessica finally found her voice again, though it came out as a broken whisper. "Mom, please. I know we've done terrible things, but I'm still your daughter. Doesn't that count for anything? Can't you find it in your heart to forgive us and give us one more chance?" For a moment, looking at her tear-streaked face, I almost wavered. This was the little girl I'd rocked to sleep, taught to ride a bicycle, helped with homework, and comforted through heartbreaks. But then I remembered Tommy's innocent voice telling me about their plans to abandon him, and my resolve hardened like steel. You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided that my death would be convenient for your financial plans, I said quietly. You stopped being my daughter when you chose to view your own son as an obstacle to your happiness. Forgiveness is something that can only come after genuine repentance and changed behavior, and nothing you've said or done today suggests that you understand the magnitude of your betrayal or that you're capable of becoming better people. The room fell silent again, as everyone absorbed the finality of my words. Margaret came over and put her hand on my shoulder, providing the emotional support I needed to finish what I'd started. I want both of you to leave my house immediately and never return, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. You are no longer welcome in my home or in my life. Any future contact regarding Tommy will go through the court system and our attorneys. As for your criminal charges, that's entirely out of my hands now. The wheels of justice are in motion, and you'll have to face the consequences of your choices. Marcus stood up slowly, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. You'll regret this, Eleanor. When you're old and sick and dying alone, you'll remember this day and wish you'd been more forgiving. Money isn't everything, and someday you'll realize that family should come first. His words were meant to hurt me, but they only confirmed that he still didn't understand the fundamental truth of what had happened here. Family had come first. That's exactly why I was protecting Tommy from people who had proven themselves unworthy of that sacred trust. I won't be dying alone, I replied calmly. I'll be surrounded by people who actually love me for who I am, not for what I can give them. I'll have Tommy nearby, growing up with values of integrity and kindness that his biological parents never learned. And I'll have the peace of knowing that I stood up for what was right, even when it was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. As Jessica and Marcus gathered their belongings and prepared to leave my house for the last time, the weight of everything that had happened settled over me like a heavy blanket. I watched them walk toward the door, noting how they moved like strangers rather than the united couple they'd once appeared to be. The pressure of their crumbling schemes had revealed the cracks in their relationship, and I suspected they would turn on each other before their legal troubles were resolved. Marcus was already muttering accusations under his breath about Jessica's family and how this was all somehow my fault, while Jessica seemed to be retreating into herself, perhaps finally grasping the magnitude of what they'd lost through their greed and deception. Just before they reached the door, Jessica turned back one final time, her face streaked with mascara and her voice breaking with what might have been genuine emotion. Mom, what am I supposed to tell Tommy when he asks why he can't live with us anymore? How do I explain to a 7-year-old that his grandmother took him away because we made some bad choices? For the first time all afternoon, I heard something that sounded like real remorse in her voice, and for just a moment, I felt a flicker of the maternal love that had driven so many of my decisions over the years. You tell him the truth, I said gently, my own voice softening despite everything that had happened. You tell him that sometimes adults make mistakes that have serious consequences, and that his grandmother loves him so much that she wanted to make sure he had the best possible chance at a happy, stable life. You tell him that love sometimes means making difficult decisions to protect the people we care about most. I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat before continuing. And if you ever genuinely change, if you ever become the kind of people who could put his needs before your own wants, then maybe someday we can revisit these arrangements. But that would require real transformation, not just promises and apologies. After they left, the house felt simultaneously empty and peaceful. Margaret, James, Caroline, the Hendersons, and David all stayed for another hour, helping me process what had just happened and making plans for Tommy's transition to his new living situation. We decided that Margaret and James would drive to their house immediately to explain things to Tommy in age-appropriate terms, emphasizing that he was loved and that this change was about giving him the best possible future. Caroline offered to help with the psychological aspects of his adjustment, drawing on her professional experience to ensure that Tommy understood this wasn't his fault and that he would continue to have a relationship with me. That evening, after everyone had gone home and I was alone in my house for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I walked through each room slowly, saying goodbye to the version of my life that had ended that afternoon. The dining room where we'd just held that devastating confrontation, The living room where Tommy and I had built so many blanket forts, the kitchen where I'd taught Jessica to bake when she was barely tall enough to reach the counter, every space held memories that were now tainted by the knowledge of how little my love and generosity had meant to the people I'd given everything to protect and support. But as painful as those memories had become, I also felt a profound sense of relief and empowerment that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Robert's death, I was living entirely according to my own values and priorities, without the constant worry about whether I was doing enough for people who had never truly appreciated my sacrifices. The weight of their expectations and manipulations had been lifted from my shoulders, and I was free to focus on the relationships and causes that actually brought meaning and joy to my life. Over the following months, I watched from a distance as the legal system dealt with Jessica and Marcus's crimes. They were both sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, and their financial lives collapsed completely under the weight of their debts and legal fees. The yacht they'd dreamed of buying was repossessed, their apartment was foreclosed upon, and they were forced to declare bankruptcy. But more importantly for Tommy's future, their criminal convictions made it impossible for them to challenge the custody arrangements I'd put in place, ensuring that he would remain in a stable, loving environment throughout his childhood. Tommy thrived with Margaret and James in ways that surprised even me. Within just a few months, his grades improved dramatically. He made new friends, and he seemed to develop a confidence and security that he'd never had while living with his parents' constant financial stress and emotional manipulation. He visited me every other weekend, and our relationship grew even stronger now that it wasn't complicated by his parents' schemes and resentments. We continued our traditions of baking together, reading stories, and working in the garden, but now these activities felt pure and joyful rather than shadowed by the knowledge of what his parents were planning. As I write this story, Tommy is now 12 years old and has grown into exactly the kind of young man I'd always hoped he would become. He's kind, honest, hardworking, and shows genuine concern for other people's feelings and well-being. The Tommy Patterson Foundation has already provided scholarships for dozens of children in situations similar to his, and I take great satisfaction in knowing that my resources are being used to protect and nurture young people rather than enabling the destructive behavior of adults who should have known better. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the harsh steps I took against my own daughter and son-in-law, and my answer is always the same. I regret that it became necessary, but I don't regret protecting Tommy and standing up for what was right. Love isn't just about giving people what they want or avoiding difficult conversations. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, enforcing consequences, and making hard choices that serve the greater good. The most loving thing I could do for Tommy was to ensure that he grew up with people who would teach him that integrity matters more than money, that family loyalty can't be bought or sold, and that true security comes from being the kind of person others can trust and depend on. That's my story. How a grandmother's willingness to face ugly truths and make painful decisions saved not just her own dignity and safety, but gave her beloved grandson the childhood he deserved. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to say no, when to walk away, and when to choose difficult justice over comfortable lies.